Well, there's a risk of major harvest failures caused by climate change, according to a new report. Scientists say it should be a wake-up call to protect our food systems. Researchers looked at weather patterns in many of the world's most important crop-producing regions. They found significant impacts in the United States, Eastern Europe and East Asia, with a reduction in harvests of up to 7%. As many as 828 million people globally don't have enough food. The United Nations estimates 80 million more people will be at risk of hunger over the coming years due to climate change-driven crop failure. Well, Peter Alexander is a senior lecturer in global food security at the University of Edinburgh.
There are two main sort of direct impacts from climate change on food production, food security. One is obviously an impact on climate suitability. If we have, generally warmer conditions, perhaps drier or perhaps wetter conditions in some locations, then obviously that can have an impact on climate suitability. And then the other, probably the more worrying activities that we're seeing at the moment is extreme weather events, and the more frequent high frequency of those events and high severity of those events. So that could be drought, it could be flooding, it could be higher temperatures causing heat stress to plants and to animals. So both of those mechanisms are kind of contributing to concerns about the impacts we'll have for food production.
The United States Department of Agriculture has reported that more than 70% of corn and soybean crops in the Midwest of the US are facing drought conditions. You mentioned the extreme weather events, different types. It's not just droughts, is it? It is other types of intense weather that are more frequent, more intense. Is there a sort of hierarchy of seriousness of events?
Not really. I mean, obviously the floods in Pakistan would be an obvious example from last year. So no, we can lose productivity through anything that changes conditions in a way that reduces the yields that we would expect. Some are easier to adapt to, and actually, interestingly, heat is relatively, can be adapted to fairly well if we have water to irrigate and obviously the infrastructure to provide that irrigation. But obviously, higher temperature conditions do tend to be associated with arid and drought conditions, and obviously, therefore, you aren't able to irrigate in that way. But there are other ways that are potential to adapt. But as the climate warms further, and that's one of the reasons for this 1.5 degree ambition, is so that we can more or less hopefully adapt to a lot of those changes at that kind of level of warming. But if we start exceeding 2 degrees particularly, then those sort of options for adaptation become more and more constrained and less able to cope with still achieving that sort of productivity that we need.
And turning to the direct human impact of this, the United Nations Human Rights Chief warned this week that 80 million more people could face hunger by mid-century, but leaders seem to be trapped in short-term thinking. How do you think we can break out of that trap and mitigate climate change-driven crop failure?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I was alluding to adaptation a second ago, but, we do need to focus on both reducing greenhouse gas emissions so that we're mitigating the impact of climate change, mitigating the amount of climate change that we're going to see. But also we need to put in place different mechanisms to adapt to that climate change. And that is production, which is, I guess, what I was stressing a second ago. But it also has to think about consumption. So changing our diets would be both a mechanism to mitigate climate change, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the foods that we consume, but also to allow adaptation by kind of decreasing the burden in terms of land area and otherwise in that food production.
And finally, looking to the future, what are the projections for resilience of global food production systems in the face of climate change, and what sort of policies and initiatives could be put in place to support farmers, for instance?
Yeah, so in terms of projections, the IPCC report that was published last year talked about 10% of current agricultural land becoming climatically unsuitable by mid-century under some of the higher warming scenarios, which is obviously very concerning, and that doesn't even take into account the sort of extreme weather events as I was discussing earlier. In terms of what can be done, you know, there is a whole range of things. So crop and livestock breeding to be more heat and water stress tolerant is one option. You know, agroecological options, you know, where combining forests and cropland together in ways that are more resilient. And there are a whole range of other things that can be done. But as I say, they only really work if we're able to keep that sort of global warming level down to say 1.5 degrees.